Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The scratching of the solid gold fountain pen against the contract was the only sound in the boardroom at the top of the Vancroft building. Harrison Vancroft wasn't just signing a piece of paper. He was erasing history. With an arrogant flick of his wrist, he authorized the demolition of a century-old farm to make way for a billion-dollar mega-resort. To Harrison, the world was a chessboard where money dictated every rule. If something stood in his way, he bought it. If he couldn't buy it, he destroyed it. Wearing a tailored suit that cost more than what most people earn in a decade, Harrison stared out the tempered glass window of his 80th floor office. The city below seemed tiny, entirely submissive. He had the power to bend governors to his will, but all that massive fortune, all his empire of steel and concrete, was absolutely useless against the ghost haunting his fortified mansion. 30 miles away, isolated in a walled estate, lay the only jewel Harrison's money couldn't polish, his 19-year-old daughter, Elysia. Her room looked less like a billionaire's bedroom and more like a sterile ICU. The air smelled of expensive antiseptic and contained despair. Heart monitors buzzed rhythmically next to her canopy bed. She was the only thing Harrison truly loved, the living legacy of his late wife. But an incurable neurological syndrome was sucking the life from her fragile body day by day. For weeks she hadn't been able to move her arm or speak a word. Harrison had spent $40 million on aggressive medical research, but the world's top specialists had failed miserably. The final diagnosis was irreversibly terminal. He firmly believed his bank account could buy an extension from death itself. What he didn't suspect, as he smiled at the demolition papers for that miserable rural farm, was that the muddy land his bulldozers would crush tomorrow held the only key to Elysia's paralyzed heart. The old farm caretaker had no money for lawyers, and now had no roof over his head, but he carried a mission that Harrison Vancroft was entirely unprepared to face. The clock was ticking, but the real question was deadly. Who would succumb first? The fragile breath of Elysia, or the monstrous ego of the richest man in the world? EVICT. Billionaire's worst nightmare was already walking through the rain, heading straight for his front door. 3 weeks had passed since Harrison's signature ordered the demolition of the old farm. While his bulldozers devoured the peaceful pastures miles away, a different kind of destruction unfolded. Within the luxurious corridors of his New York mansion, Elysia, his beloved 19-year-old daughter, was slipping away faster than the sand in an hourglass, one all his money couldn't turn back. Driven by an absolute refusal to accept defeat, Harrison transformed the western wing of his $80 million home into a state-of-the-art medical labyrinth. He flew in 3 of the world's most renowned neurologists from Switzerland, Tokyo, and Boston. They demanded 7-figure payments before even crossing the threshold. Harrison didn't blink. For days, grueling examinations filled the sterilized room. High-voltage machines whispered, and the constant shuffling of white coats haunted the mansion. Needles pierced Elysia's trembling skin, yet her chest barely rose and fell. From his dark leather sofa, Harrison saw no hope in those Ivy League-educated men. They whispered among themselves, stared at glowing spreadsheets, and slowly lost their academic composure in the face of her terrifying cellular degradation. The absolute verdict came on a dark Wednesday. Standing in the grand hall, the Swiss specialist finally gathered the courage to speak. "Mr. Vancroft, it doesn't matter how much you fund our hospitals. What Miss Elysia has defies all medical literature. Her internal organs are shutting down. She won't make it past this month." The harsh sentence fell like a guillotine on Harrison's soul. He didn't process the pain. He channeled pure fury. His heart cooled to solid stone. If science failed to save Elysia, no one was worthy of his money. He fired the doctors in a blind rage, throwing them out into the torrential rain. Science had surrendered. Now, he proudly waited for the gears of death to swallow his daughter's last breath. However, in his rage, Harrison forgot to check the surveillance cameras. Standing right outside his imposing iron gates was a fragile, weather-beaten shadow holding a wooden cross. The homeless caretaker he had ruined days ago was here, and what this seemingly insignificant man was about to do would shatter the billionaire's universe in mere seconds. The infrared security cameras surrounding the Vancroft fortress were designed to detect anything, from an armed intruder to a stray deer. But what they captured that cold, damp night wasn't a tactical threat. It was Silas Thorne. The old caretaker wore the same scuffed leather boots he had used for 30 years to plow the very land Harrison was now turning to rubble. His plaid flannel shirt smelled of wet earth and wood smoke, a violent contrast to the polished asphalt of the New York mansion's driveway. Silas had received a brutal eviction notice yesterday morning. Harrison's suited thugs barely gave him time to gather his belongings before the first bulldozer crushed his chicken coop. Any other man would be in a government shelter, drowning in self-pity or begging for legal aid. But Silas carried no luggage, and he harbored no hatred. No, his calloused hands. He simply held a worn-out straw hat and a small rustic wooden cross, carved from an oak branch of the condemned farm. As the fine rain began to fall, soaking his thin white hair, the old man planted his feet before the 15-foot iron gates. He didn't ring the buzzer. He didn't shout Vancroft's name. He merely raised his wrinkled eyes and locked his gaze directly on the only second-floor window that remained lit, the room where Alicia lay bound to the machines of death. It was as if the thick masonry and bulletproof glass didn't exist to him. Silas seemed to be investigating the very silence of the billionaire's pain. Inside his massive ground-floor office, drowning the doctor's grim news in a glass of rare whiskey, Harrison stared at security monitor number 4. The smoke from his cigar froze in the air. The millionaire narrowed his eyes, confused at first. Soon blind indignation flooded his veins, replacing the confusion with profound disgust. Who the hell let the perimeter security fail so a lunatic could die on my lawn? Harrison spat into the radio communicator. Sir, the crackling voice of the head of security echoed. We've gone out. Twice to remove him. The guard dogs recoiled. He refuses to leave, saying the great gardener sent him to watch the dying seed from above. Harrison's crystal glass nearly shattered under his grip. The audacity of this insignificant man staring exactly at Alicia's window triggered pure panic and rage. Harrison kicked his heavy oak chair away, his Italian shoes stomping toward the front door. Prepare your weapons. I'll show this parasite the difference between my power and his mud. Harrison Vancroft kicked open the massive mahogany doors of his mansion, marching into the torrential rain. Without noticing the freezing water that ruined his impeccable cashmere coat, followed by 2 heavily armed security guards, he stormed down the concrete driveway toward the grand iron gates. On the other side, fragile yet entirely indifferent to the storm-lashing New York, stood Silas Thorne. What is your damn problem, you useless worm? Vancroft's voice cracked through the humid air, louder than the thunderstorm. Accustomed to shouting orders that moved global stock markets, the magnate pointed a trembling finger at the caretaker he had just evicted. The guards readied their rifles against a wee man holding only a wet wooden cross. If you dragged your foul carcass here thinking I have an ounce of pity for kicking you to the streets, you don't understand who I am, Harrison snarled. Like a striking rattlesnake, he reached into his soaked blazer, pulled out a leather-bound checkbook, and furiously signed a blank check with waterproof ink. He crumpled the paper and threw it directly at the old man's muddy chest through the iron bars. Take your money and vanish forever, or I swear I'll release the dogs. The blank check, enough to buy half a dozen neighboring mansions, bounced off Silas's worn jacket and landed in a dirty puddle, the ink slowly blurring in the dark. Silas Thorne didn't flinch at the cold steel of the rifles. He didn't stare at the absurd fortune tossed in the mud. Slowly, the old man lifted his head. His clear gray eyes swept over the arrogant billionaire in the rain, radiating a magnetic emptiness that was terrifyingly peaceful. Harrison clenched his fists, genuinely horrified for the first time in decades. With terrifying calm, the old caretaker pointed his twisted fingers toward the illuminated second-floor window where Alicia lay dying. The land can be bought, Mr. Vancroft. Silas murmured, his soft voice heavy as lead dragging across the billionaire's mind. But the living breath of God slowly escaping that dark room above. That breath, foolish man, does not accept soaked checks without spiritual funds from a man who forgot heaven. If this story is touching you in some way, maybe it's because God starts acting when we finally decide to trust. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next will leave you speechless. Harrison Vancroft stumbled back into his heated mansion, dripping cold rain over priceless Persian rugs. He dismissed the old caretaker's warning as the ramblings of a lunatic, but before he could pour himself another drink, a piercing alarm ripped through the silent house. It wasn't a perimeter breach. It was the vital signs monitor in his daughter's second-floor ICU. Harrison's heart froze. Panic completely erased his arrogant anger. He sprinted up the majestic marble staircase, skipping steps in pure terror, followed by his armed guards. When he burst through Elysia's double doors, he braced himself for the tragic sight of nurses performing desperate CPR on her lifeless chest. Instead, he froze in absolute shock. The room was painfully silent. The private nurses stood paralyzed at the foot of the bed, hands covering their mouths. Elysia wasn't dead. The fragile 19-year-old, who hadn't moved a muscle in 6 months, was somehow lifting her torso off the air mattress. Even more terrifying to Harrison's logical mind was where she was looking. Her glassy, tearful eyes were fixed intensely on the bulletproof window facing the front gates, the exact spot where Silas Thorne had just vanished. Harrison rushed to her bedside, desperately trying to gently push her back to the sea of oxygen tubes. "No, Elysia. It's just a motor spasm. The storm scared you," he babbled, trying to wrap her impossible movement in blind medical denial. But Elysia rejected his hands. In a sudden spasm of sheer will, she grabbed her father's soaked forearm with incredible strength. Her pale lips parted, and a ghostly whisper destroyed Harrison's mighty empire in a matter of seconds. "Daddy, please," she gasped, her eyes never leaving the rain-battered window. "The angels are soaked on the iron gates. Let the man of the soft earth come in before dawn." Harrison looked out into the storm. His logic collapsed. Money was useless, and death now demanded immediate submission to a penniless caretaker. The heavy oak doors of Harrison Vancroft's private study slammed shut, echoing like a gunshot through the silent mansion. He locked the deadbolt, collapsed into his leathery chair, and buried his face in his trembling hands. The invincible mind of the billionaire, a brilliant, calculating machine that had engineered corporate takeovers and shaped entire cities, was experiencing a catastrophic failure. His daughter's impossible movement and her haunting words about the man of the soft earth played on an agonizing loop in his head. Harrison dragged a shaking hand across his soaked hair. The great Vancroft empire was built on cold logic, spreadsheets, and ruthless intimidation. There was no room for miracles. Miracles were the currency of fools traded by the weak and the poor who had nothing else to cling to. Yet sitting alone in the suffocating darkness of his 80-floor empire, Harrison felt an old, buried memory violently claw its way back to the surface. It was a memory he had spent decades trying to drown in expensive bourbon and relentless ambition. It happened 20 years ago. He was a struggling young man, kneeling on the dirty floor of a crowded public hospital. His beloved wife was dying from complications after giving birth to Elysia. In that desperate night, an impoverished and terrified Harrison had made a solemn vow to God. "If you let the child live, I will serve you. I will build houses for the poor. I will never let greed corrupt my soul." Elysia lived, but his wife passed away. The grief had hardened Harrison. He traded his faith for absolute control, turning his back on his promise and building a real estate empire fueled by endless greed. He had become the very monster he promised he would never be. Now, as the thunder rattled the massive windows of his study, the horrifying truth crashed into him. He wasn't just fighting a medical disease. He was facing a spiritual debt. Harrison lunged across the desk, grabbing the keys to his armored SUV. The logic he had worshipped his entire life had failed him, and science had officially abandoned his daughter. The doctors were wrong, but that old evicted caretaker knew exactly where the shadow over his family had come from. Stripped of his pride, Harrison bolted out the door into the pouring rain. He made the unthinkable decision. The billionaire was going to beg the homeless man for help. The tires of Harrison Vancroft's armored SUV squealed against the slick, rain-battered asphalt as he tore away from the mansion. The billionaire, who hadn't driven himself in over a decade, gripped the leather steering wheel with white-knuckled desperation. He ignored the frantic calls from his security detail buzzing on the dashboard. For the first time in his life, Harrison was abandoning his fortress of power, plunging into the dark, stormy night to find the very man he had thrown into the gutter. He drove furiously past the glittering skyscrapers of Manhattan, heading toward the impoverished outskirts of the city. He checked the eviction records on his phone. Silas Thorne hadn't gone far from the old condemned farm. The police had reported the old man seeking shelter in an abandoned, crumbling church on the edge of the industrial district. Harrison kicked open the rotted wooden doors of the ruined sanctuary. Rain poured through the shattered stained glass, and the smell of mildew and wet stone filled the air. In the center of the dark nave, illuminated only by a single flickering candle, Silas Thorne sat peacefully on a broken wooden pew. He didn't look surprised to see the world's most powerful man standing dripping wet at the entrance. "I knew the storm would bring you here, Mr. Vancroft," the old caretaker murmured, his voice echoing softly against the damp stone walls. Harrison marched down the aisle, his chest heaving. "Name your price," the billionaire gasped, abandoning all corporate poise. "My daughter. You know what's happening to her. I have billions. I'll buy this church, rebuild your farm, give you half my empire. Just tell me how much it cost to cure her." Silas slowly shook his head, his gray eyes piercing through the shadows. "You still think you are the master of this world, Harrison," he said calmly, using the billionaire's first name. Harrison froze. The old man reached into his tattered coat and pulled out a small, rusted silver locket. The blood drained entirely from Harrison's face. It was the exact locket his late wife wore on the night she died. The one Harrison had buried beneath a weeping willow tree 20 years ago when he cursed God and traded his faith for wealth. How do you have that?" Harrison stammered in sheer terror. "The soil remembers what the heart tries to bury," Silas replied gently. "Your daughter's illness is not medical, Harrison. It is the harvest of your broken vow. The cure you seek cannot be bought with your empire." Silas stood up, the candlelight casting a towering shadow behind his frail frame. "The miracle your daughter needs will cost you everything you worship. It demands absolute surrender, not a single penny of your blood money." The rusted silver locket hung motionless from Silas Thorne's calloused fingers. The faint candlelight of the Atais abandoned church glinted off the tarnished metal, illuminating a single scratched initial, M, for Martha. Harrison felt the air violently knocked out of his lungs. He stumbled backward, his billion-dollar suit useless against the supernatural cold plunging deep into his bones. How could a destitute caretaker possessed the exact necklace his late wife had worn the day she died? He had buried it himself, 20 years ago, sealing away both his grief and his faith. "You dug it up," Harrison hissed, pointing a trembling finger. "You investigated me to blackmail me." Silas stepped closer, his voice carrying impossible authority. "Your empire was built on a grave, Harrison. When Martha died giving birth to Alicia, you stood in a hospital chapel and cursed heaven. You swore that your money would fear no man and no God. You traded grace for absolute control." Harrison's throat tightened into a suffocating knot. Nobody was alive to know those exact words. "Alicia's sickness is not a biological failure," Silas continued, placing the locket into the billionaire's shaking hands. "It is the spiritual fruit of a father who built a golden cage around his heart. You amassed a kingdom of dust. And now the dust is claiming your daughter." Tears broke through the iron dam of Harrison's eyes. He dropped to his knees on the freezing stone floor. His logic had crumbled. Confronted by the blinding truth of his soul, the almighty Harrison Vancroft had absolutely no arguments left. "If this story is touching you in some way, Maybe it's because God starts acting when we finally decide to trust. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next will leave you speechless. Silence enveloped the ruined church as Harrison Vancroft, a man who commanded global economies, remained on, his knees in the muddy puddles completely shattered. All his walls of logic, power, and wealth lay in ruins around him. "What do I have to do?" Harrison pleaded, his voice cracking with a desperation he had never known. "I'll give it all away. I'll sell the empire." Silas Thorne softly shook his head, placing a firm, calloused hand on the billionaire's trembling shoulder. "God doesn't need your money, Harrison. He doesn't need your companies or your stock shares to perform a miracle. He only needs what you have kept locked away the hardest, your surrender." Harrison looked up, confused and terrified. "Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, your bulldozers will crush my farm," Silas continued slowly. "Your board of directors will be waiting for your victorious call. But to heal the sickness inside your home, you must heal the sickness in your soul. You must publicly tear up the demolition. Contract in front of your highest investors. And more than that, you must kneel before them, just as you are kneeling now, and confess that Harrison Vancroft is nothing, that your entire empire is dust without the mercy of heaven." The demand hit Harrison like a physical blow. Public humiliation to stand before the ruthless wolves of Wall Street, the very men who feared him, and bow his head like a broken beggar. His ego screamed in protest. Decades of pride flared up, desperately fighting against the idea of destroying his infallible reputation. For a fleeting second, his old corporate instincts urged him to stand up, walk away, and find a new doctor. But then he remembered Elysia's fragile chest fighting for a single breath of air. He remembered the cold machines buzzing the countdown to her death. The internal war was excruciating. It was the hardest battle he had ever fought, his lifelong pride against the overwhelming love for his only child. Slowly, Harrison closed his eyes, his massive shoulders shaking violently under his soaked suit. The monster of greed finally died within his chest. "I'll do it," the billionaire wept, emotionally surrendering to the impossible. "I'll do exactly what you say." The following morning felt heavy, pregnant with a supernatural silence that the buzzing metropolis of New York had never witnessed. Harrison Vancroft, dressed not in his impeccable tailored suits but in a simple, wrinkled shirt, led the elderly caretaker past the heavily armed gates of his mansion. He had already made the devastating phone call an hour ago, openly sobbing in front of his shareholders as he ripped up the demolition contract and confessed his spiritual bankruptcy. Now, the final step awaited in Elysia's high-tech ICU. As Silas Thorne's dirty, worn-out boots stepped onto the polished marble floors of the second-story suite, the atmosphere within the room drastically changed. The sterile smell of expensive antiseptics seemed to evaporate, replaced by a warm, fragrant scent of damp earth and spring rain. The air grew incredibly thick, crackling with an invisible electricity that made the hairs on the back of Harrison's neck stand up. The three frantic private nurses, who were aggressively adjusting Elysia's oxygen levels after another terrible drop in her pulse, suddenly stopped in their tracks. The armed security guards by the door lowered their hands from their holsters. An overwhelming, mystical peace flooded the massive bedroom, pressing against their chests like a gentle but immovable physical force. Nobody could speak. Nobody could move an inch. Silas walked slowly toward the giant canopy bed, his shadow stretching long across the floor. The chaotic beeping of the heart monitors slowed down, not fading into death, but settling into an eerie, rhythmic hum that seemed to match the footsteps of the destitute man. He didn't look at the glowing screens or the twisted IV lines. Silas stopped, right beside the dying 19-year-old girl. Harrison stood frozen at the foot of the bed, his heart hammering in his throat. The billionaire, the nurses, the guards, everyone was entirely paralyzed, completely captivated by the blinding presence dominating the room. The preparation for the impossible was complete. Silas Thorne stood motionless beside the majestic canopy bed. He didn't bow his head, and he didn't close his eyes. He didn't beg the heavens with desperate weeping prayers like the billionaire had done. Instead, the old caretaker reached out his dirt-stained hand and gently rested his thumb against Alicia's freezing, motionless forehead. A suffocating tension swallowed the room. Harrison Vancroft squeezed his eyes shut, his chest tight, terrified that this final gamble was just the cruel illusion of a broken father. The frantic nurses held their breath. Would this truly work, or was it the ultimate tragedy of science failing before madness? Then Silas spoke. His voice wasn't a fragile whisper. It rang out with an undeniable booming authority that made the IV bags tremble lightly on their metal stands. The debt of the father is forgiven. The soil is redeemed, Silas declared, staring directly at her pale face. Wake up, child of grace. For an agonizing, endless 5 seconds, nothing happened. The silence was deafening. But then, right on the glowing monitor that tracked her failing heart, the flat, deadly red line gave an impossible, sharp spike, and Alicia's pale fingers, resting heavily on the white linen sheets, twitched. Harrison choked on a sob as the flatline alarm abruptly cut off. The screen, which moments ago forecasted Alicia's inevitable death, now flashed with jagged, rhythmic peaks. It was impossible, yet defying every law of medical science. The young woman's shallow breath deepened. Strong, healthy color rushed back into her pale cheeks. The head nurse dropped her clipboard, the plastic shattering against the marble floor. Her synapses, her brain activity is spiking off the charts, she gasped, staring at the monitors as if looking at a ghost. The Japanese specialist, who had stayed behind to monitor her final hours, backed away until he hit the wall, his clinical arrogance completely destroyed by the undeniable reality unfolding before him. Harrison fell to his knees beside the bed. Alicia's eyelids fluttered, tearing away the oxygen tubes with strength she hadn't possessed in months. The impossible was happening, right there in the sterile silence. She inhaled deeply, and her lips parted. If this story is touching you, maybe it's because God starts acting when we finally decide to trust. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next will leave you speechless. The billionaire, who once stood untouchable in boardrooms, was now shaking uncontrollably on the carpeted floor of the ICU. Harrison Vancroft could barely pull oxygen into his lungs. The silence in the room was excruciating, broken only by the steady, healthy rhythm of Alicia's heart monitor. His daughter, who had been a lifeless shell for over 6 months, slowly forced her heavy eyelids all the way open. Her deep brown eyes, once cloudy with the fog of inevitable death, were suddenly clear and radiant. For the first time in an eternity, they locked perfectly onto her weeping father. The Japanese specialist covered his mouth, trembling, as Alicia reached out, pulling the intrusive oxygen tubes entirely out of her nose. Harrison gasped, terrified she would collapse. But she didn't gasp for air. Instead, Alicia propped herself up on her elbows and smiled a breathtaking, warm smile. "The harvest is full, Daddy," she whispered, her voice remarkably strong. "The debt is paid." Every single medical monitor in the room screamed the impossible truth. Alicia was completely, undeniably healed. Not just surviving, but thriving. Her heart rhythm was flawlessly steady. The young woman swung her legs over the edge of the large bed and stood on her own 2 feet for the first time in half a year. Harrison Vancroft, the ruthless billionaire who had spent his adult life buying governments and crushing the weak, entirely shattered. He collapsed onto the cold marble floor and buried his tear-stained face into Alicia's knees, sobbing with the uncontrollable, raw grief of a man finally discovering grace. The mighty king of Wall Street wept like a humbled child, his soul breaking open to let the light back in. Alicia crouched down, wrapping her warm, trembling arms around her broken father, burying her face into his wet shoulder. When Harrison finally lifted his head, his face wet with tears of true redemption, he turned around to thank the old man. But he found nothing except the heavy oak doors, completely shut. Silas Thorne had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the scent of wet earth and rain. The true miracle that night was not Alicia walking out of that sterile bedroom. It was the resurrection of a shattered man's dead soul. When Harrison ordered his security to comb the massive estate for Silas Thorne, the head guard brought back only terrifying news. The cameras showed absolutely no one entering or leaving the gates that midnight. The old farm, once destined to be bulldozed into a heartless mega-resort, was never touched by Harrison's machines. Instead of an empire of concrete, Vancroft spent his remaining fortune turning the land into a free, vast sanctuary for the homeless and the hopeless. The ruthless tycoon of Wall Street traded his bespoke Italian suits for simple denim, completely vanishing from the Forbes billionaire list. Every Sunday morning, Harrison could be found kneeling in the mud of that old farm, planting seeds alongside a perfectly healthy Alicia, thanking heaven for the greatest wealth a man could ever own, a surrendered heart.